Hello, everyone. Good afternoon and croeso. I'm Katie and I head up Food Sense Wales, a charity that is working to ensure the food we eat in Wales is good for people and the planet. I'm glad you could join us for this session to discuss the future of food in Wales. Before I introduce the panel, I'd just like to set the scene a little bit for today's session. Maybe we should start by asking the question, what is the food system? People often refer to farm to fork or sea to fork, indicating those connections between how our food is grown and processed, supplied, and then how we prepare and consume our food. In reality, our current food system is very complex. It's relying on global connections. It has a powerful impact on our health, on our environment, both our climate and our nature, and our prospects individually, as communities, and as a nation. COVID-19 and the ongoing Brexit trade negotiations are highlighting many of these impacts. So, for example, food security. People's ability to secure enough food of sufficient quality in a socially acceptable way has been impacted by COVID-19. Some people have struggled to secure the food they need as a result of restrictions of movement or through loss of income. A YouGov poll last week, commissioned by the Food Foundation, showed that 12% of children in Wales are believed to be living in families that are struggling to put sufficient food on the table. And then during COVID, a whole part of our food system was almost completely taken out of action during lockdown, the hospitality sector. The fact that pubs and restaurants had to close their doors meant gallons of milk, millions of pints of milk had to be disposed of. Flour and yeast were almost impossible to get hold of as households baked their way through lockdown, and supply chains tried to cope with the shift from hospitality style packaging, in other words, big bags, to retail, smaller bags. We saw similar challenges with eggs, with people maybe seeing plastic egg boxes replacing traditional cardboard boxes for a time. Unfortunately, we have seen a renewed reliance on plastic as we battle with COVID. Our online deliveries, which were difficult to come by in the early days of lockdown, need to be COVID secure, which relies on a greater use of plastic bags. Meanwhile, concerns grow that Brexit trade negotiations will result in the loss of our high food standards, such as animal welfare standards. But we have also seen positive action, and that's what we want to focus on today. We've seen farmers and communities pull together. We've seen an increase in box schemes as people have looked at their local farmers and suppliers. Families have been eating together more often, and more people are cooking from scratch. And there has been a growing revolution as people use lockdown as an opportunity to try grow your own. So I'm going to ask our panel today to focus on how our small but individual nation can draw on the positive aspects of the things that we've seen as a result of COVID. I'm delighted to say that around the table today, we have three experts in food system thinking who will be able to give us some insights into these issues. So we're welcoming Gary Mitchell from Social Farms and Gardens, Amber Wheeler from the Food Foundation, and Angelina Sanderson-Bellamy from the Sustainable Places Institute at Cardiff University. And I would like to invite the audience to use the Ask a Question function. And behind the scenes, we have Pearl from Food Cardiff keeping an eye on all the questions that we will endeavour to answer as many of these as we possibly can. So without further ado, Gary to start, and then Amber, and then Angelina. I'll ask you to introduce yourselves. And as you do that, could you share with us one thing that has made you think differently or done something differently around food as a result of lockdown? Gary, over to you.
Thanks, Katie. Thanks for the introduction and the summary of what we're talking about today. So, as Katie said, my name's Gary Mitchell. I'm Wales Manager for Social Farms and Gardens here as part of a job share, and I'm also a Director for the Open Food Network, a sort of an ethical trading food platform distribution model. And to answer your question, I think the one thing that really brought things home to me was I live in Powys, very rural, local authority, vast in size, predominantly agricultural based, yet there's 14 food banks operating in my local authority, and 3 of those set themselves up during this COVID pandemic to try and tackle some of that immediate issues that you were talking about. And to me, the bit of interactions I've had with the food banks, and particularly the new ones, the thing they really struggle on is dealing with fresh food and fresh fruit, produce and things like that. They historically were set up to cope with dry goods and distribution models from supermarkets out to people within an expanded time frame, and that wasn't what was needed really. We needed some immediate food relief to get out to people. So I think what I'm taking away with it is how I can support not just my local food banks but those nationally to understand distribution models that support a whole range of produce, including those fresher, healthier alternatives perhaps.
Thanks, Gary. Moving on to Angelina.
Hi there, I'm Angelina. I'm a researcher at Cardiff University, and I really work at that interface between our social and ecological systems. So really interested in looking at how people drive change in our ecosystems and how the resulting change in the ecosystems then influence people's actions. With respect to the food system during this lockdown, so we were already in a pretty good position when it came to the lockdown and securing food. We get our milk bottles delivered, we get veg every week from our local farm, we get meat as well from the farm down the road, and we've got our own chickens. But the irony is that when everything kicked off with COVID, the amount of workload just increased tremendously in order to try and keep up with the changes and understand what was happening to the food system during the lockdown period. And so ironically, my veg patch, which normally has vegetables growing in it, have an enormous amount of weeds this year, as I haven't had time to tend to our own garden here at home. But fortunately, through the research that I've been able to do, we can see that 75% of households have actually started growing food this year. So that's really encouraging. And now it's trying to understand how to convert this into longer term trends that people will maintain even after the lockdown.
Great, thank you, Angelina. Amber?
Hi, I'm Amber Wheeler, and I currently work for the Food Foundation, but and a project called Peas Please, where we try and change the system to get people to eat more veg, to help to enable people to. But I've been working in Wales, I live in Wales for the last 10 years, and looking at how we can increase horticultural production and consumption at the same time. During lockdown, I guess my biggest learning, or one of the learnings, was I've got a big family. I have 4 kids, and we had to sit down and really figure out how much food we needed to bring into the house. And I was quite surprised that our veg box that we get actually is completely, we didn't have enough at all. So I figured out that we need 50 apples a week, plus a whole load of other things, but we realized that we just need a massive box of apples every week. So that's one of my learnings, was just the sheer amount that actually we need if we're going to, stick by the health, then stay healthy.
Thanks, Amber, and that kind of ties us nicely into the first question about during lockdown, this issue of food supply did become a really hot topic, and I mentioned in my introduction about we had what appeared to be a glut of milk and beer, actually, because we had the hospitality sector closing down. But we also had people struggling to access what they needed in the supermarket, to access online shops. So one of the suggestions for preventing this kind of thing happening again in the future, as we go forward, is to look at how, instead of relying maybe on those more kind of centralised systems, that we also look at how we can produce food more locally and within Wales. So I was just wondering, Amber, we'll start with you. What types of food do you think we should be producing more of in Wales? And how do you think we should go about it?
So I'm hoping people can hear me, because somebody said in the chat that they still can't hear me, but I'm hoping that you can. Can you hear me?
Yeah, carry on. You dropped off. Carry on.
In terms of what we produce in Wales, obviously we produce a lot of milk, We produce around, the economic output is about 568 million for milk, and then cattle comes next, 404 million, and then sheep after that, 278 million. And then our horticultural production sits at around 22 million. So we produce a lot of meat and milk, but we could produce a lot more fruit and veg, and that's what my research has been about. So we produce fruit and vegetables on around 0.1% of our land in Wales. That's enough to supply around a quarter of a portion per head of population, a very tiny, tiny amount. So I would argue that there's huge opportunities, and there's been much research into the land and the good land that's available to show that more fruit and veg could be grown in different areas. But it would only take around 2% of the land to grow 5 a day in Wales, and we know that the public health recommendations have now gone up to 7 a day. But what it illustrates is that we could still have still have 98% of the land doing those other types of production, but just with bringing up that production of fruit and veg as well to around 2% of land, we could have a thriving horticulture sector alongside that. It would bring horticulture right up there into sort of the economic output to just under milk. So you'd say in 20 years' time, if we had 2% of land growing fruit and veg in Wales, then horticulture would come second to milk in terms of economic output. But it would also help contribute towards health. We know that if people eat 5 a day, they could gain another 7 to 8 months of healthy life. And if we were to have that sort of consumption, everybody eating 5 a day, from some of the calculations we've made, we could be decreasing our greenhouse gas emissions by up to 30%. So there's lots of benefits that could ensue from that.
So that last statistic, 30%.
Up to 30% of greenhouse gas emissions.
So Angelina, I'm just thinking. We've got this. It really looks like we have a huge benefit from increasing the amount of population in Wales. Why aren't we doing it?
I'm sorry, Katie. I didn't quite catch that question.
We've got is everyone hearing a little bit of repeating on the? Yeah, I'm getting a bit of feedback. I'm not sure if I'm saying that that's a central problem.
It's better now.
Okay, right. I'll come back to you again, Angelina. So Amber was just saying that there looks like, from a public health perspective and from looking at a climate change perspective, that there would be a real benefit for us to be producing more fruit and veg in Wales. And I was just wondering, what's the problem? Why aren't we doing more of it?
I think that one of the issues that we have in Wales is that a lot of our productive lands or a lot of the land mass in Wales is in the uplands. I think roughly 80% of the land area in Wales is in uplands. And so that has traditionally developed into more of a livestock farming culture. And that has been pushed, I would say, in the last 30, 40 years by our farming policies as part of the EU, and the different types of subsidies that farmers receive have really encouraged a more intensified kind of farming system where farmers focus on producing one product and doing that as efficiently as possible. But what we see is, in terms of the ecology of the system, a mixed farming system, which it has the capability of recycling nutrients on the farm and creating more of a diversified system where you have multiple different crops growing. You've got animal production as well. You're recycling that manure that's generated by the animals and using that in your crop production is much more healthier for the land, because we're able often in these systems to restore the soil, reduce the amount of external inputs, which often are quite intensive in terms of CO2 emission. The synthesized fertilizers, the pesticides that are used can be reduced to zero. And one great example that we've got here in South Wales is Slade Farm, and what Graham and Polly Wilson are doing with the farm there. They've been certified organic. They've got cattle, sheep, pigs growing on the farm. They've also, in the last, I think 3-4 years, have started growing vegetables and managing a CSA there on the farm. And so this sort of mixed system, producing multiple different outputs and recycling throughout the farm, has created basically a closed system, and illustrates what is possible to do almost by going back a bit. We need to go back 40-50 years. It was a much more knowledge intensive system. It relied very heavily on the farmer's knowledge of the land, as opposed to I think a lot of production systems have moved to a more technified kind of production system that relies a lot on external expert opinion to follow different calendar cycles and whatnot, rather than following what is needed on the land. And each area is quite different. So I think there's an opportunity there to create more of a mixed approach to our production systems, so that through that we could increase the amount of horticulture that is done here in Wales.
Okay. That's really interesting. You used the term Angelina CSA, which I'm going to ask Gary to kind of build on a little bit for us. But also, I guess Slade Farm is a farm that's out in the countryside, and I'm wondering, could we be growing some more in our urban spaces as well, in our towns and our cities? Gary, it'd be good to get your view on this.
Yeah, definitely. So taking Angelina's point of CSA, community supported agriculture, definitely room to create more of those sort of systems around Wales, build on what England have been able to do in their CSA movement. And I think it's about, partly relocalizing food, so getting food grown in the areas where it is produced. But in Wales, actually, we know we've only got a few cities as such and a few very large towns. A lot of Wales is rural, but that doesn't stop us growing on the fringes of those urban conurbation areas. And certainly even within it. And we've certainly seen the rise of urban agriculture coming through in Wales. We've got 22 incredible edible network movements now across Wales. So that's towns and communities that are getting out into their local green spaces within their town and producing food as a bit of a byproduct, much more about social inclusion. And I think the biggest gains are had through the likes of CSAs and through incredible edible movements are the connections that people make with food again. So they get that hands-on appreciation. Their values around food change quite dramatically and quite quickly. We learn to really invest in what food we're consuming and understand it better. We get to feel that sort of real well-being benefit from getting our hands dirty, touching the soil, feeling the fruit, and understanding when stuff is grown and when it shouldn't really be available in the supermarket, but it is. So I think, there's huge values there. And the other one that I'm just keen to just explore and start thinking around is that more technological solutions around food production and what we're terming in Wales as controlled environment agriculture. I don't think it's a solution, but I think it might have a part to play. We know through lots of learning, particularly from, let's say, Asian countries, Japan, China, likes of those, you can produce vast amounts of fresh produce that is nutrient high, because you can tweak the nutrients to a degree, and I know that's a little bit scary, but in a small area right in the heart of the communities that might need it. Now there's carbon issues attached to those and things like that, but I think we've got an opportunity in Wales to trial and test and see where that might be able to take us. I mean, some of these systems can literally produce tons of fresh produce per day, if not per week. And we know that we're currently struggling with our fresh food production in Wales. And that might just be one avenue to explore and see how it looks and really get an understanding of what its benefits are and perhaps what its restrictions are.
That's great. Thanks, Gary. So, interesting to hear from the panel that there looks like there's almost innovation to be had both through conventional farming and old techniques and revisiting those techniques, but also looking at what technology might be able to bring to the table as well as we move forward. But I think what was interesting was the aspects around the involvement of people. And, you know, for many people, the pandemic really has shown how important food is. So, you know, for example, Cardiff, which is a veg city, has been helping to get more people involved in growing, cooking and sharing food, and exactly in the way, Gary, that you said, you know, working with networks like Incredible Edible. So, you know, Cardiff Growing Together as a local food partnership, which distributed 14,000 vegetable plants to residents to help them grow their own food through the pandemic. And the event here today is actually the start of a month-long Good Food Cardiff Autumn Festival to build on this work, to look at sharing produce and celebrate growing, even if it's just growing weeds, Angelina. And we know that like things like this have been happening all across the country here in Wales, but also across the United Kingdom. So I'd like to ask Amber if she can tell us how we think we can build on this in Wales, this community involvement, and how we can support people to really get involved and be part of the solution going forwards.
Hi, I'm hoping that you can hear me okay. I've got my fan on my laptop is going crazy, so please give me a thumbs up if from the panelists if you can hear me okay. It's okay. Could maybe somebody else should answer the question and whilst I go onto a phone, is that okay, or shall I try as I am?
We can hear you,
Okay. Well, one of the things people could do, we run a project called Peas Please, and it really is about trying to get more vegetables available and promote that side of things. And we're running what's called a Veg Advocate programme for people who want to become involved in Peas Please. Veg advocates are people who sort of understand some of these big issues around the food system and those barriers to consumption that are sort of beyond our individual control, those political barriers, the availability barriers. For instance, you only get one portion of vegetables per 3 meals eaten out on average. So some of these things that you can work on changing. So if you would like to be involved in the Veg Advocate programme, Food Sense Wales is promoting workshops, is running workshops in Wales. Food Foundation is running them in England. And Nourish Scotland in Scotland, and Belfast Food Network in Northern Ireland. But of course, for your if you want to do something in Wales, then you contact Food Sense Wales, and the lovely Pearl at Food Cardiff and Food Sense Wales would arrange for you to come along to an online workshop where you could hear a bit more about Peas Please beyond what I've said today, and it would introduce you to the Veg Advocate programme, which runs for 3 years, and you could be involved for a few years in helping to shape things and hopefully increase the amount of veg available.
That's really interesting. Thanks, Amber. And I think I'm going to ask you to go on. Let me see if that's better. Yeah, thanks, Amber. But I am going to ask you. Another question, Amber, off the back of that. So you'll need to get your finger ready to unmute again. I was just going to ask about the Peas Please programme and the sorts of other people that are involved in that programme. It works with a series of pledges, which is working across the food system, which is what we're talking about here today. Could you just explain a little bit about how that works?
Okay, so in Peas Please, we believe that the problem to increasing consumption lies beyond our individual control. There are some things that we can do as individuals, but that we also need to involve producers, we need to involve retailers, we need to involve people involved in wholesale and in catering and in procurement, and we need to involve government. So we work across all those areas. We work with big businesses and small businesses to try and increase the amount of veg available. So some of the big businesses that we have involved are the majority of the supermarkets, actually, Tesco's, Aldi, Lidl's. And then some of the smaller businesses, say in Cardiff, we've got I think a cafe in Cardiff who's trying to do good things to increase the amount of veg on offer. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, that's great. Again there. Thank you. Yeah, just to build on that, we've pledges from across the different sectors as well. So the likes of Cardiff and Vale Health Board are signed up to make sure that they're increasing as much veg as they can in their meals for staff. And Castle Howell and Brains are a couple of the big businesses in Wales that are involved, as well as Puffin Produce, who are one of our major producers in Wales for vegetables. So I just wanted to build on that, Angelina. I'm going to come to you next and just ask from some of the research that you've done, what have you found works in terms of trying to involve people more in how they can access and make more decisions about the food that they're buying and growing and eating?
Yeah, so one of the projects that I've been running for the last 18 months is Tea Grains, and Tea Grains really looks at what is the impact of building relationships back into our food system. So it's based on the premise that over the last 50 years, our food system has become more and more globalized, and that includes really, really long supply chains to get the food from where it's grown in other countries across Latin America, Africa, South Africa, Asia. Those chains that get the food from those places where they're produced to where we consume it here in Wales. And through that, we've really lost the relationship to our food. And that also means that sometimes we make decisions about purchasing foods that don't necessarily align with our values around food, but that's because we don't see how these foods are produced or the impact of that production. So with Tea Grains, what we're looking at is here within the Wales, what happens when you reconnect people to the source of their food and those relationships get built again. And so we had been looking at these community supported agricultures because typically they operate as a vegetable box scheme. So you would sign up for it, and there's different kinds of models, but the idea is that every week you would get a bag or box of vegetables that are produced on the farm. And we've been interested in looking at when people sign up for those schemes, what then happens with their household food behaviors in terms of the food that they buy, the way they prepare their food, the foods that they eat. And what we've seen actually is that by building these relationships back, they promote further sustainable actions, and it creates a greater respect for the food that you get. And because of that respect, it inspires more cooking at home. It inspires people to cook their meals around the vegetables that they're receiving. And it also inspires a smaller amount of waste. A really great example is one of the households that we were interviewing. When they spoke about the vegetables that they were getting in the bag, they said, well, normally by Monday or Tuesday night, we would go out to eat for a meal. But if I look in the vegetable box in the refrigerator and I see that we still have vegetables, then we stay at home and we prepare a meal using those vegetables, because I don't want to waste those vegetables because the farmer has produced those vegetables for us. We know him. We respect the work that he's doing. We don't want to waste that. So it's really sort of gathering the evidence to understand how these relationships influence food behaviors that are healthier and more sustainable, and then thinking forward to how we can promote that once we have the evidence base. So the whole COVID experience has been, and that's why I said earlier, I just didn't really have the opportunity to grow my own vegetables, because there was so many interesting things happening around the lockdown. And we see that on the one hand, these different CSAs and local farms had a surge in demand for their food products. I think many of them are operating wait lists. They just couldn't meet all of that demand. And on the other side, with the households, what we see is that 20% of households who hadn't previously sourced food from local farms started doing so under lockdown conditions. So then it's thinking, how do we convert that into that long-term change, not just for those households, but also for the producers, because there's been a lot of uncertainty. How long will this demand last? You know, how much should we invest in increasing our production? Because come next year, those new people who came to us, are they still going to be interested in sourcing their vegetables from us? So that's been one of the big challenges, and sort of looking forward and thinking how to capitalize on these opportunities that we see happening to move our food systems towards greater sustainability and healthier outcomes.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Angelina. And I guess the researchers are going to be really interested in this issue of those behaviours that have changed for people over lockdown. You know, how are they going to sustain? You know, we're seeing this shift in working patterns, for example, and you know, we're not necessarily being encouraged here in Wales at the moment to return back to the workplace, and how does that affect the local food infrastructures that we have at the moment? And you know, maybe there are opportunities around where people live to be developing more of these structures, and if people are at home more, they can, you know, it's easier for them to be able to accept online deliveries and that kind of thing. Gary, I know you've got lots of experience in this area from your various different hats, both in terms of interesting work that's going on in Newtown, but also with the Open Food Network platform that you've been working on. How does that? It'd be interesting to know how that platform kind of works to get buy-in from consumers. Yeah,
thanks. I think I definitely echo Angelina's sort of points and concerns around actually how do we, having had a bit of a shift towards better food systems, how do we retain people? So some of the data coming out from the Open Food Network is we saw a 660% rise in increase in shop fronts and trading through the platform when restrictions to supermarket access, shielding, things like that, fresh produce just literally not being available was around. And actually on the back of that, we know that an awful lot of on the ground production started to happen because people saw this huge rise in demand. Land armies started in Wales, but actually sadly we're seeing the other end of it already with some of the events coming through, and we've lost 20% of that growth already, and that's a fairly steadying curve now going downwards, which is a real shame. But actually on the sharper front, and I see Julia's proposed a question there, we've got fields of fresh produce now in the ground in some areas, with growers wondering how they're going to actually find a market for it, because obviously the hospitality sector and trade still isn't there. But a lot of that was done on the back of sort of COVID, almost reactionary type growing. So that's something we're going to have to keep a real strong eye. But Open Food Network, it relies on building of a local sort of food hub, I would call it. That's the simplest way to look at it, where small scale producers of any shape or size that are dealing in, let's say, sustainable, ethical food can get their produce to a central point, and it then gets redistributed to the consumers around them. So if we look at one of our better examples, say Plymouth in the Tamar Valley, we have a food hub called Tamar Grow Local, and that supports nearly 40 small producers from around the Tamar Valley, but actually the food that's coming in through the hub is nearly enough to feed Plymouth in its fresh and sustainable food needs. So it's about gathering it up. No grower can do it on their own. No procurer wants to buy from lots of different individual growers. So it's just a technological solution to getting food to the right point to then be distributed under quite strong ethical values.
That's great. Thanks, Gary. And I think, you know, one of the other areas that we haven't mentioned is this piece about, you know, how difficult it is for people to have the connections through food when, you know, it's become difficult for people to meet up and go to the pub easily, or go and have a coffee easily, or go out for a meal, or go around to other people's houses. All of that kind of aspect that would be around kind of communities coming together around food has been really challenging. And one of the programmes that we work on in Food Sense Wales is Food for Life get-togethers. which is now having to think about how they can promote this idea of bringing people together through food, in different ways, through using different platforms. So then there's had to be quite a lot of innovation around how we use different digital platforms, and I think that's something that's obviously going to build as we move forward in this brave new world. I'm going to go on now and ask some questions that we've got coming in from the audience. We've got one here from Julia Lim, who is asking, how can we make it possible for fruit and veg growers to make a basic, let alone a good living? How can we value fresh food and not expect it always to be cheap? And I think that this is a question around, the fact that fruit and vegetable can be perceived to be more expensive. How do we make sure that, although we want people to be eating more fruit and veg, we make it possible for them to be able to be eating more fruit and veg, and making it attractive industry for people to be involved in. And I think, now we've got Amber back on the screen. It'd be interesting to get your views on, this tension that we have in the food system around how we need people to be eating more fruit and veg, and yet the returns that farmers are getting are not necessarily enough to make it an attractive industry.
Absolutely, we're in an incredibly difficult situation. It's a lot of people refer to it as squaring the circle. How do we do it? How do we manage to make sure people can make a living by selling the stuff at the same time as we've got really high levels of food poverty, and we want those people to be able to afford a healthy diet? I think we've put a little bit of context in this. So for those on our lowest 10% of incomes in this country, it costs about 76% of their disposable income to afford the Eat Well guide. And a lot of that is the fruit and veg component. So there are real financial barriers for people on low incomes to be able to afford fruit and veg. And I think we have to deal with those separately in a way to the other issue, which is making a thriving horticulture sector. So I'll deal with that one first. And I'd say that we need more intervention in terms of benefits for those on lower incomes, to the benefits that cover sort of a basic food need. We have healthy start schemes and things like this, which we need to expand, but really we need those levels of benefits to be covering people to be able to afford a healthy diet. We know that healthy food is 3 times more expensive than unhealthy food, and it is a really tricky situation. So at the same time, you've got the horticulture sector who need to be supported, because historically they haven't been supported. So they're actually in a really difficult situation. They haven't had the subsidies that other agricultural sectors have had. So what we need from the Welsh Government and others are a sort of support for the horticulture sector in terms of investment in infrastructure. And when we look at those, that's what people are asking for. We did a big report with Better Food traders and communities, and found that all those veg boxes during coronavirus, they increased their sales enormously, but 82% of them had waiting lists, and they could have fulfilled more. They could have made more. And they said the 2 things that they needed was, one was investment in infrastructure. So actually quite small amounts, you're talking thousands per producer. And the other thing was a clear vision from government and a sort of clear support for the sector. And we're, as part of Peas Please, working on those things. We've got a meeting as part of the Fruit and Veg Alliance with Victoria Prentice, the Agri Minister, on Wednesday, presenting a clear vision for the horticulture sector. In Wales, we've got a fantastic umbrella organisation called Ymunwch Cymru, who supports the horticulture sector, and they're working on a sort of a bigger vision for the sector as well. And let's hope they come through with some sort of investment too.
That's great, thanks Amber. And I think one of the things that we've we've been talking about is how you kind of drive some investment, some small scale investment, which we're going to try and do a bit of pilot work on with people. One of the things, I guess, that you didn't pick up on, Amber, that would be interesting to just explore for a minute is the bit about Healthy Start vouchers, because this is a support mechanism that is a government support mechanism for low-income families, for pregnant women and children under the age of 4 to access some additional support to purchase fruit and vegetables. And at the moment, I understand that scheme has been asked to be expanded so more people can access it, but also increasing the value of the voucher that people receive. Would that help the sector at all?
I think so. And we've also got businesses who are offering to match fund the Healthy Start vouchers in terms of bumping up the amount of fruit and veg the amount of money that's offered on the fruit and veg aspect of the Healthy Start voucher. It would help, but it's a drop in the ocean really compared to what really needs to happen for everybody to be able to afford fruit and veg, not just those sort of mothers of young children.
Okay, thanks, Amber. And Angelina, I just drawing on this issue, but also bringing in a question from Marcus Braun around how Welsh Government and local councils can support a more inclusive, localised food production system. And I guess one of the things we haven't really touched on yet is this issue of public procurement. I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about that.
I was just thinking about that, and actually one other aspect is the next agri-environment scheme that will be introduced here in Wales. So I think through both of these models, they can become means to support our producers to move to more agroecological practices. And for those who are already doing so, to be able to continue that and to earn a good living, because under the current agricultural policies of the EU, farms that are under the size of 5 hectares, for example, don't qualify for any kind of payments. And a lot of our sort of horticultural businesses, farming businesses, are quite small and tend to be under 5 hectares. And so I think a crucial role in moving forward is including support, especially targeted at those farms practicing agroecology and horticultural production. And in that way, coming back to Julia's question, we can ensure that producers have a good living, one that they can live well off of. In terms of thinking about that sustained demand for the products that these agroecological producers produce, procurement is a really fantastic tool for creating this. And I think this ties in a bit with what Gary was talking about as well, with respect to food hubs and the Tamir Valley Food Hub. It can be really challenging for procurement to have to make contracts with lots and lots of small scale producers, but through different use of technology and applying it to these sorts of food hubs, we can bring together the production in such a way that it could meet the size of procurement contracts. And so the food that the government procures for our schools and for our hospitals and government offices, that should all be a good quality production that's produced here in Wales. There's no reason why these two shouldn't be matching up. And that then creates that steady, reliable source of demand that producers will need in order to be confident to make the investments in increasing their horticulture supply.
Yeah. That's really interesting. And I think, it's interesting we're turning to government, but we know that government are going to be really, really tight on funds as we move through these increasingly difficult times. And we've had a question in around, how do we get people to invest in this? How do we get the private sector to invest? How do we encourage, individuals to invest in this? So, Gary, I'm going to ask you, if Joe Bloggs has got some money to put into his local food system, what does he do with it? How does he?
Thanks. Yeah, it's a really interesting question to be asked. So thanks for coming to me. I think to answer the question that's out there, it's about getting to know what's in your area already. Who are the food actioners? Who are the people really passionate about food. What are they doing? What support do they need? Where are the gaps? And in fact, I was in Aberystwyth. I was lucky enough to spend the day in Aber on Thursday, walking around potential new food growing sites. A whole mix of private land, some organisational, institutional owned land, some local authority owned land, but actually getting access to that land can be really tricky for a small community group feeling on their own out there. So that's part of a lot of the work we do, is almost that middle brokerage between communities and landowners, be they local authorities, universities, health boards, things like that. But yeah, if I was going to start an investment chain, I'd be looking at who am I investing in, because that, in any sort of business sense, that's partly where the risks are. What are the people like? How committed are they? How dedicated are they? And I can certainly assure you that most people involved in food growing are really committed. We know that it's not there for income generation, it's there for the sort of the wider benefits that they get out of it. So that's where I'd start to look at who are the actioners in the area that I might want to invest in, because I'm passionate about that area, for instance. Find them, have those conversations, see what needs they might have, because they're not always huge. They're not always hundreds of thousands of pounds, as we've talked about. Actually, some of the small scale investment needs for small growers is a matter of £1,000 can actually really make a difference. And I talked to a grower only the other day that just needed a couple of £100 to upgrade to a new phone so he could do more online trading, because actually he didn't have that basic resource of a, let's say, an up-to-date smartphone that can really integrate with the best technology that is out there. So it wasn't a lot of money, but actually funding those smaller growers is really tricky in our current system.
Thanks, Gary. And I think just to sort of maybe finish this bit a little bit, I think it's quite interesting. I think that we've had a question earlier also asking about, how can we become a truly regenerative and sustainable food system? And Welsh Government are doing quite a lot of work around how they will support business moving forwards and thinking about green recovery, and things like the economic contract, which Welsh Government are adopting to really to kind of make the links between the funding that they're giving out to businesses and organisations is attached to a set of principles around, things like making sure there's fair working conditions and fair wages, looking at the environmental aspects, looking at public health aspects. And I think that's really, really important for those parameters to be really well nailed down as we move forward into the next phase. I'm going to close the session now. We've got only got a couple of minutes left. I think we might have lost Amber again, but I would like to ask maybe one final question to have a think about. So, Gary and Angelina, as you're still with us, what would you recommend one thing for people to do after this festival to help the future of food? We've heard some ideas about people who might be willing to invest, but what are the other sorts of very either practical steps or maybe some big lofty ideas of what people could do to support the food system? Angelina, can I come to you first?
Sure. I think if I have to sum it up easily into one line, maybe the easiest sort of rule to follow by is about eating as locally as possible, as seasonably as possible. And so that's about connecting with your local food producers and supporting that food production. And we've seen that happen under COVID, and now it's about sustaining that interest. And if we can even continue to grow that interest by people going out there and finding out about what food is produced in their region. Another thing I just wanted to point out, because there was the question about regenerative agriculture and the way forward, is a report that I wrote together with Terry Marsden and was published commissioned by WWF last March about creating a food system for future generations. So there we made a series of 10 recommendations and 3 different overarching things to follow. And one of those is really about building up a national food vision. And that's from the top, but also from the bottom. And, going out, engaging with people in the communities to find out what is it that they want for their food in Wales, and what kind of vision can we build, and then using that vision to inspire local actions that can support producers and consumers, or better maybe if we think about them as food citizens, in terms of supporting the choices they would like to be able to make and creating changes in our food system so that they can make those choices. Because it's not always just a matter of, well, consumers aren't choosing this. It's also a matter that the structures in place don't allow consumers to make the choices they'd like to be making. So maybe that was a bit of a long answer, but there you go, Katie.
Great, Angelina. So, you're talking about, a national food vision that actually involves people helping to shape that vision, but people then also really thinking about how they can support and make connections with their local producers and food generally in their local area. And Gary, what do you think is the one sort of top tip that you would give people in terms of helping to support our food system in Wales?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a difficult one, isn't it? Because we're all different and we all approach things differently. But I think for me, it would be about finding out more about where your food comes from. So what does that journey from sort of farm to fork look like? And can you see it all the way along? Because if you can see it all the way along, then that's really good. And you understand it, and you understand the pressures that are around the production systems, the distribution systems, the controlled environment it needs to be stored in, etc., etc. But if you're quite distant from that, it's really hard to understand it. And then, as we know, if you do get a better hands-on understanding, your values of food really do start to change. So that would be one. And as I'm an advocate of community growing, I'd say the best way to do that is through your nearest community growing group. We've got a network of over 500 sites across Wales, so there's never one too far away to just go and have a conversation with, have a dabble with, go and have a cup of coffee with them, see what they do, see why they do it, because that's really important for me. They're all in it for different reasons. And then if you can lend a hand and get involved, all the better.
That's great. Thanks, Gary. And I know we haven't got Amber here for the end, but I think I can be fairly sure that having a PhD in fruit and vegetables, that I think Amber would advocate everyone thinking about trying to eat as close to their 5 a day for fruit and vegetables as they can. So I'm going to finish off there today by saying thank you very much to the panelists and to the audience and to the fantastic questions that we've had through today. I think it's been a really interesting debate, and I think it's something, for me, it feels like we should be doing more of this and opening up the conversation more broadly across Wales. As Angelina said, trying to think about how we can co-create this national vision for what food should look like in Wales. And actually, I can let Amber have the final say. I am closing, Amber, but I am going to let you say the one thing.
So sorry.
No, not at all. I'm going to let you
do is, with your veg box scheme, set up a direct debit, or with your local producer, set up a direct debit so that they know that they've got the income coming in, and that will really give them confidence going forwards. And that's one thing that everybody can do, is just make a regular payment to one of your local food producers, and that will help develop the sector.
That's a really great top tip and a really great practical thing to end the session on. So I will say thank you again. Thank you, Amber, for persisting with the technology. And thanks, Gary, and thanks, Angelina. Enjoy the rest of the day, everyone. Bye-bye.